Outpost Zeta-9 was a forgotten speck on the edge of Orion's frontier, a lonely, desolate station perched on a barren moon. Sandstorms raged across its surface, and the only sound inside its cold metallic walls was the distant hum of neglected machinery. For months, the Marines stationed there had existed in silence, their only companions the distant stars and the weight of an uneasy peace. Until today. Sergeant Vega, the squad leader of Orion's Space Marines, stood at the outpost's command center, staring at the holographic display of an incoming fleet. Revenants. The massive alien ships emerged from hyperspace like shadows, blotting out the stars. Their arrival wasn't unexpected, but the sheer size of the force approaching made his blood run cold. He knew the outpost's defenses were woefully inadequate for what was coming. "Looks like they've finally found us," Vega muttered under his breath. He turned to his team. Scattered across the room, each warrior in various stages of gearing up. "We've got incoming, and it's big. No time for reinforcements. We're on our own." Private Axton, the youngest of the group, was the first to speak. "We can hold them, right, Sarge? I mean, we've got the defenses. Shields, turrets." Vega cut him off with a grim nod. "We've got defenses. Not enough, but we'll make them work. This isn't about winning, Axton. It's about holding the line as long as we can." The rest of the Marines silently understood. There was no fear in their eyes, only the hardened resolve of soldiers who had faced death countless times. They knew the drill. They were trained for this. Sergeant Vega paced in front of the tactical display, outlining their battle plan. "We'll split into teams. Fox, you and your crew set up the mines and traps along the perimeter. Mason, you handle the sniper nests. Keep them pinned down when they land. The rest of us will focus on fortifying the outpost." Corporal Fox nodded sharply. "We'll give them hell, sir." As the Marines broke off to their tasks, Vega lingered by the console, his fingers tracing the edge of the hologram. He knew that holding Outpost Zeta-9 wasn't just about survival. If the Revenants took this moon, they'd have a direct path to the human colonies beyond. This was about buying time. He keyed the outpost's communication system. "This is Sergeant Vega of Orion's Space Marines at Zeta-9. We've got an incoming hostile fleet, overwhelming numbers. Reinforcements requested, though we don't expect you'll get here in time." He paused, his jaw clenched. "We're making our stand." The reply was static. Nothing. Vega cut the comm and turned to face the window, staring out at the dark, unforgiving void. The Revenants would be here soon. There was no turning back. Minutes stretched into hours, the eerie silence before the storm growing heavier with each passing moment. Then the alarms blared. The Revenants had arrived. Explosions lit up the sky as the first wave of enemy dropships descended toward the outpost. The Revenants' infantry were monstrous, armored creatures bred for war, each one a towering brute of muscle and rage. They charged at the Marines' defenses with a terrifying speed, their shrieks echoing through the outpost's halls. Private Axton fired the first shot. His plasma rifle spat blue fire, taking down the lead Revenant in a burst of energy. The rest of the Marines quickly followed, raining down a barrage of plasma, explosives, and sniper rounds into the enemy ranks. But for every Revenant that fell, two more seemed to take its place. Sergeant Vega ducked behind a barricade, barking orders over the roar of battle. "Fox, how's the perimeter?" Fox's voice crackled over the comm. "Mines are holding, but we're losing ground fast. They're too many." Vega cursed under his breath. The Revenants were relentless, pushing harder with every second. The outpost shook as the enemy hit the defenses with everything they had. Plasma blasts streaked through the air, turning the barren moon into a chaotic hellscape of fire and steel. Inside the outpost, the Marines fought like demons. Corporal Mason picked off Revenants from her sniper nest, each shot precise and lethal. Fox's squad used hit-and-run tactics, setting off traps and luring the aliens into choke points. But it wasn't enough. The Revenants kept coming. Hours passed, and the once quiet halls of Zeta-9 were now filled with the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and the screams of the dying. The Marines had pushed back the first wave, but it had cost them dearly. Half their number were dead or injured, and supplies were running low. Vega leaned against the wall, his armor scarred and battered, his breathing ragged. "We've bought some time," he said, his voice hoarse, "but it won't last. Get ready for the next wave." Before they could regroup, alarms blared again. But this time it wasn't the Revenants. Vega rushed to the command center, his heart sinking as he saw the damage to their defense systems. Turrets offline, shields malfunctioning. How the hell? Vega muttered, checking the logs. Someone had tampered with the systems. It wasn't an enemy attack, this was sabotage. He turned sharply, suspicion burning in his eyes. Who did this? The Marines looked at each other, confusion turning to tension. There was no time for a full investigation, but it was clear they had a traitor among them. And just as the next wave of Revenants landed, they were already fighting a war from within. As the Revenants closed in, the outpost's turrets sputtered and died, leaving the Marines exposed. Vega's mind raced. They were already outnumbered and now betrayed by one of their own. A cold fury settled over him. Vega addressed his squad, his voice low and deadly. We find the traitor? Then we finish this. The Marines fought on, but the sabotage had thrown everything into chaos. Revenants breached the outer walls, and the battle turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Amidst he fighting, Vega and Fox tracked down the traitor, a Marine named Harker, who had been secretly working with a rival faction to sell out the outpost for profit. Harker's betrayal was swift and unforgivable. Without hesitation, Vega dealt with him, the execution quick and cold, but the damage had already been done. Now, with their defenses in shambles, the Marines retreated to the final holdout, a fortified command center deep within the outpost. Their numbers had dwindled to just a handful, but each of them was ready to fight to the last breath. Private Axton stood beside Vega, his face pale, but his grip steady on his rifle. We're not making it out of this one, are we, Sarge? Vega glanced at him, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Doesn't matter, kid. We're here to fight. That's what we do. The second wave of Revenants hit harder than the first. Plasma fire erupted in every direction, turning the final defense into a brutal, bloody slaughter. The Marines fought like demons, every last ounce of strength focused on taking as many of the enemy with them as they could. In the chaos, one of the Marines, Corporal Fox, made the ultimate sacrifice. Seeing the overwhelming numbers, she rigged the central reactor to overload, knowing it would wipe out the entire base along with the Revenants. You get the rest out, Sarge. I'll finish this. Vega knew there was no time to argue. With a nod, he led the remaining Marines to the evacuation point. The outpost was moments away from total destruction, but Fox's sacrifice bought them the time they needed. As the Revenants breached the final line, the outpost's reactor detonated in a blinding flash, consuming everything in its path. The Revenants, the traitor, the outpost itself, all of it was wiped out in an instant. Vega and his surviving Marines, bloodied but unbroken, watched from a distance as the moon was engulfed in light. They had lost everything, but in their final stand, they had saved humanity from an even greater threat. The Revenants hit with ferocity beyond anything the Marines had faced before. Their hulking forms stormed through the outpost's outer defenses, monstrous and relentless, as if they had no concept of fear or exhaustion. Plasma fire erupted from every direction as the Marines fought back, holding their ground with sheer force of will. Sergeant Vega moved with practiced precision, his rifle spitting bursts of blue light, cutting down the first wave of Revenant infantry. Behind him, Corporal Mason was perched in the sniper nest, taking down the enemies that moved too fast for the rest of the squad. Every shot she fired was perfect, hitting targets at their most vulnerable points. But even her expert marksmanship wasn't enough to stem the tide. Vega barked orders into his comm. Fox, we need more traps in Sector 5. They're pushing through. Fox's voice came back, strained but focused. Already on it, but they're not stopping. Explosions rang out as the Revenants triggered the hidden mines. Several of the massive aliens were torn apart, but more took their place, surging over the wreckage with terrifying speed. The Marines had fortified well, but the sheer number of Revenants crashing into their defenses was overwhelming. Each alien was a walking fortress, their heavy armor soaking up plasma fire that would have dropped any other opponent. Private Axton, fresh out of training and still learning the ropes, had taken position near Vega. His hands shook as he reloaded his rifle. There's no end to them, he muttered under his breath, sweat dripping down his brow. Vega gritted his teeth. There's always an end. We just have to hold long enough to find it. The Revenants didn't slow down. More dropships landed just beyond the perimeter, and alien war machines rumbled toward the outpost. The Marines had set up makeshift barricades, forcing the invaders into narrow choke points, but even that didn't seem to slow them. The aliens poured through, firing plasma bolts that melted steel and sent shockwaves through the walls. Despite the chaos, the Marines held. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. But they fought on, retreating only when absolutely necessary. There was no panic in their movements, only grim determination. They knew what they were up against, an enemy that gave no quarter and expected none in return. Vega called for a tactical retreat to the next defensive line, his voice calm and measured. Fall back, keep them pinned down, but don't get cut off. The Marines moved like a machine, covering each other as they pulled back to the inner perimeter. Explosions lit up the landscape behind them, a fiery reminder of the sacrifices they were making with each step. Private Axton stumbled, nearly dropping his rifle, but Vega was there in an instant, pulling him back into position. "Stay focused, Axton," Vega growled. "We're not done yet." The young Marine nodded, breathing hard, and leveled his rifle at the advancing horde. His shots were shaky, but they hit their mark. A Revenant warrior stumbled, plasma burning through its chest, but the others pressed forward, unrelenting. In the control room, the outpost sensors flickered as the Revenants hacked into their systems. Vega cursed under his breath as he saw the warning lights flash. They were losing more than just men. They were losing control of the battlefield. But there was no room for doubt. Not here. Not now. "Hold the line," Vega shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "We hold, no matter what." And they did. Against all odds, the Marines held the Revenants back, using every trick, every tactic they knew. Fox's team detonated explosives that collapsed entire sections of the outer walls, burying dozens of aliens under tons of rubble. Mason kept the pressure on from above, her sniper fire relentless, picking off any Revenant foolish enough to step out of cover. But the cost was high. The Marines' numbers were dwindling. The Revenants moved, preparing for another push toward the base. But this time, the Marines didn't wait. They moved out from the outpost, using the broken terrain to their advantage. Mason's sniper fire provided cover, each shot keeping the Revenants pinned down just long enough for Fox's team to plant explosives along key structures, creating a distraction. Vega led the strike force through the wreckage, navigating past destroyed turrets and burning wreckage. The Revenant command ship loomed ahead, a massive, hulking monstrosity, pulsating with energy. It was their lifeline, the core of their entire operation. As they approached the ship, Vega signaled for silence. The Revenants patrolled the perimeter, unaware of the Marines closing in. Fox and his team moved quickly, placing charges on the ship's vulnerable points. "We've got about 5 minutes once these go off," Fox whispered, setting the final charge. "Then everything's going up." Vega nodded. 5 minutes is all we need." The charges were set. Vega gave the signal, and the Marines moved in, breaching the ship's outer hull in a coordinated strike. Plasma fire filled the air as the Marines carved a path toward the central reactor. They moved with precision, each Marine covering the other, their training and discipline pushing them through the chaos. Inside the ship, the corridors were tight, the atmosphere oppressive. The Revenants fought viciously. But the Marines pushed forward, laser-focused on their goal. Explosions rocked the ship as the planted charges began to detonate, destabilizing the structure. They reached the reactor chamber, a massive room pulsing with energy. This was it, the heart of the Revenant fleet. Vega turned to Fox, who was already preparing the final explosive. "You know what to do." Fox nodded, setting the timer. "We've got 1 minute before this whole place blows." Vega's gaze swept over his team. They had fought valiantly, given everything they had, and now it all came down to this. "Let's get out of here." They moved quickly, retracing their steps through the burning corridors. The ship groaned as it began to collapse, flames licking at the walls as explosions tore through the hull. The Marines sprinted toward their extraction point, plasma fire raining down on them from the remaining Revenant forces. Mason's sniper fire picked off enemies with deadly precision, keeping their path clear as they raced against the clock. As they reached the outer edge of the ship, the final explosion erupted behind them. The reactor went critical, a massive shockwave tearing through the Revenant command ship. The blast was blinding, a bright white light that consumed everything in its path. Vega and his team barely made it out, diving for cover as the shockwave tore through the battlefield, sending debris flying in every direction. The Revenants that remained were thrown into disarray, their command structure obliterated. The battle was over. Vega stood, battered, and bloodied, watching as the Revenant forces scattered, their invasion falling apart without leadership. The Marines had won. The battle had torn the moon apart, the landscape a shattered wasteland of debris and smoke. The outpost, or what was left of it, stood as a broken shell in the distance. Sergeant Vega and the remaining Marines watched from a ridge, exhausted but alive. The Revenants were in full retreat, their ranks broken without the command ship to guide them. Vega leaned against a rock, catching his breath. His armor was scorched, his muscles aching from the relentless fighting, but he was still standing. The mission had been a success, more than anyone had expected. They had stopped the Revenants, at least for now. The price had been steep, but they had won. The outpost had done its job. Private Axton, bloodied but alive, limped over to Vega. "So, we did it?" His voice was filled with disbelief. The young Marine looked out over the battlefield, the remnants of the enemy fleeing into the blackness of space. Vega nodded slowly, his eyes hard. "Yeah, we did." There was no cheer of victory, no celebration. Just the heavy weight of what had been lost and what had been saved. The surviving Marines gathered in silence, their numbers now a fraction of what they'd started with. Corporal Mason joined them, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her face a mask of calm despite the destruction around them. "We bought them time," Mason said, her voice low but clear. That's what mattered. Fox, the demolition expert, was inspecting his gear, making sure nothing was left behind. He glanced up at Vega, his face weary but resolute. "We gave them more than time, Sarge. We gave them a chance." "That's enough for me." Vega said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of Fox's words settle. He looked out at the horizon, where the dark shapes of distant ships began to appear. Reinforcements. Too late to save the outpost. Too late to change what had already happened, but not too late to pick up the pieces. The comms crackled to life, the voice of the fleet commander cutting through the static. "This is Fleet Command to Outpost Zeta-9. What's your status?" Vega activated his comm, speaking into the helmet mic. "This is Sergeant Vega, Orion Space Marines. Revenant forces neutralized. Outpost lost. Request immediate evac for surviving personnel." There was a pause on the other end, then the reply. "Copy that, Sergeant. Evac inbound. Stand by." The Marines exchanged tired glances. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. They knew this wasn't the last time they would face the Revenants. The aliens would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger. But for now, they had dealt them a blow they wouldn't soon forget. As the evacuation shuttles touched down, Vega gave one last look at the remains of Outpost Zeta-9. It had been a brutal fight, but they had done what no one thought possible. They had held the line against impossible odds. They had fought for every inch of ground, every second of time, and they had won. Without another word, Vega and his team boarded the shuttle. As they lifted off, leaving the desolate moon behind, Vega allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. They were soldiers, built for war, and they had fulfilled their duty. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Revenants would be back. But so would they.